The morning sun of Zephyria Prime cast long shadows across the sprawling slave market, turning the metal cages into a labyrinth of darkness and despair. The air hung thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, and the ozone smell of shock collars. Hundreds of beings from across the galaxy stood, sat, or huddled in their assigned spaces, each representing a tragedy that the Galactic Consortium preferred not to acknowledge. Captain Marcus Chen adjusted his worn leather jacket as he moved through the crowd of buyers, his brown eyes scanning not the merchandise, but the faces of those who would purchase sentient lives as easily as they might buy livestock. 3 months of undercover work had brought him to this moment, and the weight of his hidden recording devices felt heavier with each step. The Terran Liberation Front had sent him here with a mission: document the slave trade's operations and identify the key players. What he hadn't expected was to feel the crushing weight of every cage, every pair of hopeless eyes, every being who had been reduced to a price tag. The market operated with the efficiency of any commercial enterprise. Auctioneers called out in multiple languages while translators hummed their mechanical interpretations. Wealthy merchants in flowing robes examined potential purchases like they might inspect the engine of a starship, checking teeth, testing reflexes, and discussing breeding potential in casual tones that made Marcus's stomach churn. This was the dark heart of the galaxy's economy, the shameful secret that funded colony expansion and corporate profits. Marcus had been posing as a representative of a mining consortium for weeks, establishing his cover identity in the seedier districts of the trade stations that orbited Zephyria Prime. His fabricated credentials identified him as someone looking for heavy labor workers, the kind of buyer who dealt in volume rather than specialty slaves. It was a cover that allowed him to ask questions without drawing too much attention, to photograph documentation without seeming suspicious, and to record conversations that would hopefully bring this entire operation crashing down. The morning auction was in full swing when Marcus noticed her. Unlike the other slaves who were displayed prominently to attract buyers, she sat in a corner cage that seemed deliberately positioned to be overlooked. The auctioneer hadn't even mentioned her in the morning's roster, and the few buyers who glanced in her direction quickly moved on with expressions of distaste or disappointment. She was clearly from one of the humanoid species, though her azure skin marked her as non-Terran. Her build suggested she had once been strong, though malnutrition had taken its toll over what must have been years of captivity. But it was her eyes that stopped Marcus in his tracks. Where he expected to see the broken spirit common among long-term slaves, he saw something entirely different: unbroken defiance mixed with a profound weariness. She wasn't beaten. She was waiting. As Marcus moved closer, he could see why buyers avoided her. Scars crisscrossed her arms and face in patterns that spoke of repeated punishment rather than accidental injury. Her left hand was missing 2 fingers, the stumps healed but obviously the result of deliberate amputation. Most telling of all was the tattoo that covered her right shoulder, 47 small marks arranged in neat rows each, one clearly representing something significant in her culture. "That one's been here 3 years," said a voice beside him. Marcus turned to find a Valorian merchant, his insectoid features clicking with what passed for amusement among his species. "Killed her previous owner and half his guards before they subdued her. No one wants that kind of trouble." Marcus kept his expression carefully neutral. "What's her species?" "HFY from the Windless Moon system. Their entire civilization was wiped out in the Krellian expansion about 5 years ago. She's probably the last of her kind, which should make her valuable, but..." The Valorian gestured with one of his 4 arms toward her cage. "She's killed 47 slavers since her capture. They keep her around as a cautionary tale." The weight of that revelation settled on Marcus like a physical blow. The last of her species, watching her people's destroyers profit from her suffering, and still fighting back after 3 years. He found himself moving toward her cage, almost without conscious decision. She looked up as he approached, and Marcus felt something shift in the air between them. Her eyes were the deep violet of her people, and they held an intelligence that decades of captivity hadn't dimmed. For a moment, they simply regarded each other across the metal bars that separated them. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the melodic accent of her homeworld despite its roughness from disuse. "You are different," she said, in perfect galactic standard. "The others look at me and see either danger or failure. You look at me and see something else." Marcus crouched down to be at her eye level, ignoring the stares of other buyers who thought he was wasting his time. "I see someone who's survived when survival should have been impossible. I see someone who's kept fighting when others would have given up." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "You are human." It wasn't a question, but Marcus nodded anyway. "My name is Marcus. Kirareth of the Windless Moons," she replied. the formal introduction carrying the weight of nobility despite her current circumstances. "Why do you speak to me as if I am still a person?" The question hit Marcus harder than any punch he'd ever taken. Around them, the market continued its casual trade in lives, but this moment felt separate from all of it, important in a way he couldn't quite define. "Because you are a person. Because what's happening here is wrong, and someone needs to acknowledge that." Kirith was quiet for a long moment, her violet eyes never leaving his face. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you here to buy slaves, Marcus of the humans?" Marcus glanced around, making sure no one was close enough to overhear. The nearby buyers had moved on to examine a group of young Tyrillians who were generating much more interest. "I'm here to end this," he said quietly. "All of it. But that's going to take time, and I can't help everyone at once." "But you could help one," Kirith said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't despair either. "The others fear me because I have killed, because I refuse to be broken. But you humans are warriors too, are you not? Your people's reputation has reached even here." Marcus thought about the growing human military presence in this sector, about the Terran Liberation Front's mission to expose and destroy the slave trade, about the public outrage back on Earth as stories of galactic slavery made their way through the news feeds. "We're trying to be," he said finally. "Then perhaps we could help each other," Kira Iath said. "I know things about this operation that your people would find useful. Names, locations, shipping routes. I have had 3 years to listen and observe while they thought I was just another broken slave." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was beyond what he had hoped for. A witness with inside knowledge could accelerate their investigation by months, maybe years. But more than that, the thought of leaving her in this cage when he had the power to change her fate was becoming unbearable. "The auction starts in an hour," Kirith continued. "They will offer me again, though they expect no bids. If someone were to purchase me, I would be legally owned according to consortium law, but I would also be removed from this place."
Marcus was already running calculations in his head.
The TLF had provided him with enough funds to make moderate purchases as part of his cover. Buying a single slave who had been repeatedly rejected would actually strengthen his false identity while accomplishing their mission. But it would also mean taking responsibility for another person's life in ways he wasn't sure he was prepared for. As if reading his thoughts, Kirapayan spoke again. "I do not ask for your charity, human Marcus. I offer an alliance. My knowledge for my freedom. My assistance for your protection until we reach human space." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. A Krellian overseer was making his rounds, his massive reptilian form casting shadows across the cages as he passed. Marcus stood slowly, pulling out a datapad to make notes as if he were considering a purchase. "I'll be back before the auction," he said quietly. Kiritha nodded once, then settled back into her corner, as if their conversation had never happened. But Marcus caught the slight straightening of her shoulders, the barely perceptible change in her posture that suggested something had shifted in her world. As Marcus walked away, he found himself thinking about the stories he'd heard growing up about humanity's first contact with galactic civilization, how humans had been dismissed as a minor species from a backwater world, too primitive and emotional to contribute meaningfully to galactic society, how that assessment had proven catastrophically wrong when humans had brought their peculiar combination of stubborn idealism and tactical brilliance to conflicts across the galaxy. Now, standing in the middle of the largest slave market in this sector, Marcus understood that humanity was about to prove the galaxy wrong again. Not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through something the other species had forgotten: the radical belief that every sentient life had value. The auction horn sounded across the market, its deep note calling buyers to the central platform. Marcus checked his chronometer and confirmed his funds one more time. In 30 minutes, he would either be walking away with crucial intelligence and a living reminder of why the TLF's mission mattered, or he would be walking away empty-handed while someone who had trusted him remained in hell. As he moved toward the auction platform, Marcus made a silent promise to the blue-skinned woman in the corner cage. Whatever happened next, she would never have to face it alone. The auction platform rose from the center of the market like a metal monument to greed, its elevated stage allowing buyers scattered throughout the complex to observe the proceedings. Marcus positioned himself toward the back of the crowd, close enough to bid, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention from the more serious buyers who had gathered near the front. The auctioneer, a tall Vorthan with the characteristic grey skin and oversized eyes of his species, activated his amplification unit, and began the morning's proceedings. The first hour passed in a blur of transactions that made Marcus's skin crawl. Young beings barely out of adolescence sold as domestic servants, skilled technicians whose only crime had been being on the wrong side of a corporate merger, warriors from conquered worlds stripped of their weapons and dignity, marketed for their combat training. Each sale was conducted with the casual efficiency of a commodity exchange, complete with quality assessments, warranty discussions, and bulk purchase discounts. Marcus forced himself to take notes, maintaining his cover as a mining representative while internally cataloguing every detail that might later help the Terran Liberation Front identify and prosecute the buyers. His hidden recording devices captured faces, voices, and transactions that would eventually serve as evidence in what he hoped would be the largest war crimes tribunal in galactic history. Finally, the auctioneer's voice took on a distinctly different tone. Next, we have item 774. Kethai female, approximately 28 standard years, previously owned. Due to behavioral issues, starting bid is set at minimum market value of 500 credits. Marcus watched as two guards brought Kiriath to the platform. She walked with her head up, her movements controlled and dignified despite the restrained collar around her neck. The crowd's reaction was immediate and predictable. Murmurs of recognition mixed with sounds of disgust and disappointment. Several buyers actually moved away from the platform as if her presence might somehow contaminate them. As you can see, this specimen shows signs of disciplinary scarring. The auctioneer continued, his professional demeanor never wavering. Previous owner reported aggressive tendencies and resistance to standard conditioning protocols. However, she possesses notable strength and has demonstrated remarkable survival instincts. Intelligence tests indicate above-average cognitive function within her species parameters. Marcus felt his jaw clench at the clinical language used to describe someone's suffering. Around him, the crowd was already losing interest. A few buyers made half-hearted inquiries about her species' physical capabilities, but their questions were answered with warnings about her violent history. The consensus was clear. Whatever her potential value, the risk wasn't worth the investment. "Do I hear 500 credits?" the auctioneer called out, scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency. Silence stretched across the platform. Marcus could see Kirath's face from his position, and despite her controlled expression, he caught the slight tightening around her eyes. She had expected this. 3 years of watching others get chosen while she remained had prepared her for another rejection. But knowing something was coming didn't make it hurt less. 400 credits? The auctioneer tried again, his tone suggesting he was already preparing to move on to the next item. Still no response. A few buyers had already turned away, heading toward the refreshment vendors or examining their datapads for upcoming lots. The Valorian merchant who had spoken to Marcus earlier clicked his mandibles in something that might have been sympathy or amusement. 300 credits for immediate removal, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who had conducted this particular routine many times before. Marcus stepped forward, raising his hand. 500. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visible. Heads turned, conversations stopped, and even the auctioneer paused for a moment before recovering his professional composure. The bid was significantly higher than necessary given the lack of competition, which suggested either serious interest or serious inexperience. "We have 500 credits, the auctioneer announced, clearly pleased to move beyond the minimum threshold. "Do I hear 600? The silence that followed felt different from before. Instead of disinterest, it carried a tension that Marcus recognized from his military experience. The crowd was reassessing, trying to understand what this unknown buyer saw that they had missed. A few whispered conversations started up, and Marcus caught fragments of speculation about his motives and identity. "Going once for 500 credits, the auctioneer called out, following standard protocol despite the obvious lack of competing bids. Marcus used the waiting period to observe Kiriath's reaction. She had found him in the crowd, and their eyes met across the platform. There was surprise there, and something else that might have been hope, though she kept her expression carefully controlled. 3 years of disappointment had taught her not to trust good fortune too readily. Going twice. The final moments stretched longer than they should have, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Marcus found himself thinking about the mission that had brought him here, about the thousands of other slaves who would remain in captivity regardless of what happened next, about the political and legal complications that would arise from actually purchasing another sentient being. But all of those considerations faded when he looked at Kiriath and saw not a strategic asset or a source of intelligence, but a person who deserved better than the fate the galaxy had assigned her. Sold to bidder 379 for 500 credits. The crowd dispersed almost immediately, most buyers already focused on the next lot. Marcus made his way toward the processing station, where legal ownership would be transferred and payment collected. The bureaucracy of slavery, he reflected bitterly, was as efficient as any other government service. The processing clerk, a bored-looking human woman who clearly found her job routine, handed Marcus a data pad containing the standard purchase agreement. Payment method? She asked without looking up from her screen. Credit transfer, Marcus replied, providing his false identification codes. The TLF had ensured his cover identity included substantial financial backing from a legitimate mining consortium, complete with transaction history and corporate documentation. As the payment processed, Marcus reviewed the ownership documents that would make him legally responsible for another person's life according to Galactic Consortium law. The language was coldly clinical, referring to Kiraeth as biological property and outlining his rights and responsibilities as an owner. The document included warnings about her violent history, recommendations for containment and conditioning, and a liability waiver protecting the market from any future problems. "Will you be requiring transport services?" the clerk asked, finally looking up as the transaction completed. "We provide secure shipping to most systems in this sector." "I have my own ship," Marcus replied. "When can I take possession?" "Immediately. Standard neural collar remains active until you reach your destination and complete registration with local authorities. Here's your ownership beacon and command codes." She handed him a small device that would supposedly give him complete control over Kiraeth's movements and actions through the collar's neural interface. Marcus pocketed the device without activating it, following the clerk's directions toward the holding area, where recently purchased slaves awaited pickup. The holding facility was marginally better than the display cages, with basic sanitation and nutrition stations, but it still felt like a prison. Guards with shock weapons monitored the area, ready to enforce compliance from anyone who might be feeling less than cooperative about their change in ownership. Kiraeth sat alone in one corner, as isolated from the other recent purchases as she had been from potential buyers. The neural collar around her neck hummed softly, its blue lights indicating active monitoring mode. According to the documentation, the device could deliver anything from mild discomfort to complete nervous system shutdown, depending on the owner's preferences and the slave's behavior. When she saw Marcus approaching, Kiraeth stood slowly, her movements careful and controlled. The collar's presence obviously affected her balance and coordination, adding another layer of indignity to an already degrading situation. But her eyes remained clear and alert, focused on his face with an intensity that suggested she was still processing the reality of what had just happened. "Kiraeth of the Windless Moons," Marcus said quietly, stopping just outside the designated interaction zone. "I'm here to take you to my ship." She nodded once, then looked around at the guards and other slaves in the holding area. When she spoke, her voice was pitched low enough that only Marcus could hear. "The collar monitors conversations, and the guards report unusual interactions to market security." Marcus understood immediately. Whatever alliance they had discussed would have to wait until they were away from this place and its surveillance systems. For now, he would have to play the role of slave owner while she played the role of property, no matter how much the charade disgusted them both. "Follow me," he said, adopting the tone he had heard other buyers use with their purchases. "We leave immediately." The walk through the market toward the spaceport felt like the longest journey of Marcus's life. Other buyers nodded respectfully, assuming he was another business owner who had found a good deal on labor. Vendors called out offers for supplies and services needed to maintain his investment. And through it all, Kiraeth walked 2 steps behind him, her eyes straight ahead, playing the part of a defeated slave while Marcus knew she was memorizing every detail of their route and their surroundings. The spaceport itself was a maze of landing platforms and cargo areas, with ships of every description loading passengers and freight bound for destinations throughout the sector. Marcus's cover ship, a mid-sized cargo hauler, called the Meridian's Edge, sat on Platform 17, its legitimate cargo manifest and crew documentation provided by TLF operations to support his mining consortium identity. As they approached the ship, Marcus caught sight of movement in his peripheral vision. 3 figures in the distinctive armor of consortium security were approaching from different angles, their positioning suggesting this was more than a routine inspection. Marcus's training kicked in automatically, his mind racing through possibilities and contingency plans while his body language remained casual and unconcerned. "Captain Chen," called out the lead security officer, a tall Andromedian whose tentacled face showed no expression Marcus could interpret. "Routine post-purchase inspection. Please present your documentation and prepare for cargo scan." Marcus handed over his identification and purchase papers, maintaining the slightly annoyed demeanor of a businessman dealing with bureaucratic delays.
Is there a problem, officer?
Standard procedure for first-time buyers, the officer replied, though his tone suggested something more than routine interest. Your purchase has an unusual history. We want to ensure proper containment protocols are in place. As the security team conducted their inspection, Marcus noticed Kiraeth's barely perceptible tension. Her eyes moved constantly, tracking the positions of all three officers while maintaining the appearance of passive compliance. Whatever she was thinking, she was smart enough not to let it show. The inspection lasted 20 minutes, during which the security officers examined the ship's cargo holds, crew quarters, and detention facilities. They paid particular attention to the restraint systems Marcus had been required to install as part of his cover identity, testing the neural collar's interface with the ship's security network, and verifying that proper monitoring protocols were in place. Everything appears to be in order, the lead officer finally announced, though his tone suggested disappointment. Remember, Captain, you are responsible for your property's actions once you leave consortium space. Any incidents reflecting poorly on this market's reputation will result in significant legal and financial consequences. Understood, Marcus replied. We'll be departing within the hour. As the security team moved away, Marcus led Kiraeth up the ship's boarding ramp and into the cargo hold that would serve as her quarters during their journey. The space was functional but austere, equipped with basic life support and the monitoring equipment required by law. Once they were inside, and the ramp had closed behind them, Marcus activated the ship's internal privacy screens, blocking external surveillance. For the first time since their conversation in the market, he and Kiraeth were truly alone. The weight of what they had just accomplished, and what it meant for both of their futures, settled between them like a tangible presence. They were no longer strangers separated by cage bars. They were allies bound together by necessity and mutual risk, heading into an uncertain future that would test everything they thought they knew about justice, freedom, and the price of doing what was right. The ship's engines hummed to life around them, preparing for a departure that would take them far from the slave markets of Zephyria Prime and into the vast uncertainty of space. But first, there were conversations to be had, plans to be made, and trust to be built between two beings who had found each other in the darkest corner of the galaxy. The Meridian's edge cleared Zephyria Prime's gravity well, 6 hours after departure, finally reaching the safety of hyperspace where external surveillance became impossible and internal conversations could be conducted without fear of monitoring. Marcus had spent those first hours playing his role perfectly, conducting routine ship operations while Kiraeth remained in her assigned quarters, both of them maintaining the fiction that she was simply another piece of cargo being transported to its destination. Only when the hyperspace transition was complete did Marcus allow himself to breathe freely. The privacy screens were active, the neural collar's external monitoring functions had been safely disabled, and for the first time in months, he could drop the carefully constructed persona that had gotten him this far. The relief was so intense it was almost physical. He found Kiraeth sitting cross-legged on the floor of her quarters, her eyes closed in what appeared to be meditation. The neural collar still circled her neck, its lights dim but still active, serving as a constant reminder of her legal status despite their current safety. When he entered, she opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that held both gratitude and wariness. "We are truly away from that place?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful hope of someone who had learned not to trust good fortune too readily. "We're in hyperspace, bound for the Kepler system," Marcus confirmed. "It'll take us 4 days to reach human space, but we're beyond consortium jurisdiction now." He gestured toward the collar around her neck. "I can disable the restraint functions, but the collar itself has anti-tamper devices. We'll need proper medical facilities to remove it safely." Kiraeth nodded slowly, her fingers automatically moving to touch the device that had controlled her movements for 3 years. The neural interface causes pain when tampered with. Several slaves have died attempting removal without proper equipment. Marcus pulled out the control device he had been given at purchase, studying its simple interface with disgust. With a few quick inputs, he disabled every restrictive function the collar possessed, leaving only the basic life support monitors active. "That's the best I can do for now, but at least it won't cause you pain or limit your movement." The change in Kiraeth's posture was immediate and remarkable. Muscles that had been held rigid by the collar's neural restrictions relaxed, allowing her to move with the fluid grace that was natural to her species. She stood and stretched, testing her full range of motion for the first time in years, and Marcus caught a glimpse of who she must have been before captivity had tried to break her spirit. "Now," Marcus said, settling into a chair across from her, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what we're both doing here." Kirithith regarded him with the intense focus he remembered from their first meeting, her violet eyes missing nothing as she evaluated his words and expressions. "You are not a mining consortium representative," she said finally. "It wasn't a question. No, I'm not. I'm Captain Marcus Chen, Terran Liberation Front, here on an intelligence-gathering mission that just became considerably more complicated." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, placing it on the table between them. "This is a personal recorder. Everything we discuss will be encrypted and transmitted to TLF Command when we reach human space. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of human government." The gravity in his tone seemed to settle over Kirith like a physical weight. She leaned forward slightly, her attention completely focused on his words. "The Terran government has been aware of the galactic slave trade for 2 years now, ever since our diplomatic missions started encountering evidence of it in the outer systems. What we discovered violated every principle of human civilization and several articles of the treaties that brought us into galactic society." Marcus's voice hardened as he continued. "We've been conducting covert operations throughout this sector, documenting the trade networks, identifying the major players, and gathering evidence for what we hope will be the largest war crimes prosecution in galactic history." Kirith absorbed this information in silence, but Marcus could see her mind working, connecting dots and drawing conclusions with the sharp intelligence that years of suffering had not dimmed. When she spoke, her questions went straight to the heart of the matter. "How many humans know about this operation? And what makes you think the other species will care about your evidence when they profit so greatly from the system as it exists?" Marcus smiled grimly. "Those are exactly the right questions to ask. The operation is known to fewer than 100 people in human government, but it has support at the highest levels. As for the other species," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "we're not counting on their moral awakening. We're counting on human public opinion and the economic leverage that comes with it." Explain. "Humanity might be new to galactic civilization, but we've become a significant economic force remarkably quickly. Human manufacturing, human agricultural techniques, human entertainment, human military technology, all of it has become integral to the galactic economy in ways that weren't anticipated when we first made contact." Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity of someone who had spent months thinking through every angle of a complex problem. "If humanity withdraws from galactic trade over the slavery issue, it will cause economic disruptions that will make the Krellian recession look like a minor market adjustment." Kirith's eyes widened slightly as she grasped the implications. "You would start a trade war over this? We would end our participation in a civilization that tolerates the buying and selling of sentient beings," Marcus corrected. "The economic consequences aren't the goal. They're just the method of getting other species' attention. But yes, if that's what it takes, humanity is prepared to isolate itself from galactic society until the slave trade is abolished." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and consequence. Kirith stood and moved to the small viewport that looked out into the swirling colors of hyperspace, her reflection ghost-like against the impossible geometries of folded space-time. "My people had similar ideals," she said quietly. "We believed that civilization meant protecting the weak, that advanced technology created obligations rather than just opportunities. The Krellians disagreed. They destroyed our entire system because we refused to sell them mining rights to our sacred moons." Marcus felt the weight of her loss, understanding now why the tattoos on her shoulder represented kills rather than victories. "I'm sorry. That should never have happened." "Sorry." Kirith turned back to face him, and there was something fierce in her expression. "The Krellians who destroyed my world said they were sorry too. They regretted the necessity, they claimed. They mourned the loss of Kethai culture, even as they sold the survivors into slavery." She moved back to her seat, leaning forward with an intensity that made the air between them seem charged. "But you, Marcus Chen of the Terran Liberation Front, you are not sorry in the way they were sorry. You are angry." "Yes," Marcus said simply. "I am." "Good. Anger can accomplish what sorry never could." Kirith was quiet for a moment, then continued with the tone of someone making a decision that would change everything. "You spoke of evidence and documentation. I have 3 years' worth of information about the slave trade networks. Information gathered by someone the traders dismissed as broken property. Names, routes, financial structures, political connections, all of it committed to memory, because they never imagined that the Kethai possess eidetic recall." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was beyond what he had hoped for. intelligence that could accelerate their investigation by years. But more than that, he was struck by the trust Kirith was showing by offering it freely. Why? He asked. You could have traded that information for better treatment, for freedom, for anything you needed. Why did you hold on to it? Because I knew someday someone would come who understood that revenge and justice are not the same thing, Kirith replied. The Krellians want revenge for every slight, real or imagined. The Valeronians want revenge for their lost empire. Even some humans, I suspect, want revenge for the insults they suffered when they were new to galactic society. She paused, studying his face. But you want justice. You want the system to change, not just the people who benefit from it to suffer. That is worth preserving information for. Marcus found himself thinking about the weeks he had spent undercover, watching transaction after transaction while maintaining his cover and gathering evidence. The temptation to act directly, to free whoever he could through violence or sabotage, had been constant. But he had resisted because he understood that individual rescues, while satisfying, wouldn't address the systematic nature of the problem. Justice is harder than revenge, he said. It requires patience, planning, and the cooperation of people who don't necessarily share your values.
Yes.
But it also creates lasting change rather than temporary satisfaction. Kirith leaned back, her expression thoughtful. I have watched 47 slavers die by my hands, and it accomplished nothing except to make me a cautionary tale. But the information I possess, properly used, could dismantle networks that have operated for centuries. They spent the next several hours going through the intelligence Kirith had collected during her captivity. Her recall was indeed extraordinary, providing details about shipping schedules, financial transfers, political bribes, and operational security that Marcus could never have obtained through surveillance alone. She had names of government officials who took payments to ignore slave shipments, routes used to avoid inspection stations, and financial institutions that laundered money for the trade networks. More importantly, she had identified the key vulnerabilities in the system. The slave trade, for all its apparent power, was actually quite fragile when viewed from the perspective of someone who had observed its inner workings for years. It depended on political corruption that could be exposed, on shipping routes that could be interdicted, and on public ignorance that could be shattered with the right evidence presented at the right time. The Zephyria Prime market is actually one of the smaller operations, Kirith explained as they reviewed her mental map of the trade networks. The real center is the Sigma Draconis system, where they hold the quarterly auctions for military and industrial slaves. Representatives from every major power attend, including several human corporations that officially claim to oppose slavery. Marcus made careful notes, already thinking about how this information would be used once they reached human space. The hypocrisy angle would be particularly effective in generating public outrage, and specific corporate names would give human authorities targets for prosecution under existing anti-slavery laws. As the hours passed, Marcus found himself impressed not just by Kirith's intelligence, but by her strategic thinking. She understood the political and economic forces that sustained the slave trade in ways that went far beyond her personal experience. Her questions about human capabilities and intentions showed a sophisticated grasp of interstellar politics, and her suggestions for using the intelligence she provided demonstrated tactical insight that would be valuable far beyond their current mission. You should know, Marcus said as they concluded their session, that once we reach human space, you'll be debriefed by people much more senior than I am. The Terran Liberation Front reports directly to the Colonial Defense Ministry, and intelligence this valuable will reach the highest levels of government. Kirith nodded thoughtfully. And my status? Legally, I remain your property until we reach human jurisdiction. The question highlighted the strange limbo they found themselves in. Marcus owned her according to Galactic Consortium law, but that ownership was meaningless in human space, where slavery was not only illegal but considered a crime against sapient rights. The transition from slave to free person would happen automatically when they crossed into Terran jurisdiction, but the paperwork and legal complexities would take time to resolve. Legally, you'll be free the moment we dock at a human station, Marcus explained. Practically, we'll need to establish identity documents, arrange housing, and figure out your long-term status.
The TLF has procedures for this kind of situation, though I'll admit you're the first person with intelligence this sensitive that we've extracted from the trade networks. Extracted.
Kirith smiled slightly, and it was the first genuinely happy expression Marcus had seen from her.
I like that better than rescued or saved. It implies I had something to do with my own liberation. As the conversation wound down and they prepared for the rest of their journey, Marcus reflected on how much had changed in the past 24 hours. He had come to Zephyria Prime as a spy gathering intelligence on an important mission. He was leaving as something much more complicated, a partner in what might become the most significant political and moral challenge humanity had ever undertaken in galactic society. The next 3 days would be crucial for both of them as they prepared for a return to human space that would mark the beginning of a much larger conflict. But for now, they were simply two beings who had found each other in the darkest corner of the galaxy and chosen to trust each other with their lives and their futures. The transition from hyperspace to normal space always carried a moment of disorientation, but emerging into the Kepler system felt like waking from a nightmare into sunlight. The familiar blue and white marble of New Geneva hung before them, humanity's primary diplomatic and administrative center in this sector, surrounded by the organized bustle of human shipping lanes and defense platforms. After 4 days in the alien geometries of folded space-time, the sight of home was almost overwhelming. Marcus guided the Meridian's edge through the standard approach vectors, his hands steady on the controls despite the tension that had been building during their final day of travel. The intelligence Kirith had provided was safely recorded and encrypted, ready for transmission to TLF command. But the real test would come in the next few hours as they navigated the political and legal complexities of their return. Beside him in the co-pilot's seat, Kirith watched the approaching station with obvious fascination. The neural collar around her neck had been completely deactivated, though they had agreed to leave it in place until proper medical facilities could remove it safely. Her violet eyes tracked the movement of human ships with the intensity of someone seeing the future take shape before them. "It's different from what I expected," she said quietly. "More organized. Most species' home systems feel chaotic, with competing authorities and conflicting priorities. This feels unified." Marcus followed her gaze to the orderly traffic patterns and standardized communication protocols that governed movement through human space. Humanity learned early that cooperation was essential for survival. When you're the newest species in a galaxy full of older, more powerful civilizations, you can't afford internal conflicts. The comm system chimed with an incoming transmission from New Geneva Station Control. "Meridian's Edge, this is Approach Control. Please transmit your manifest and passenger documentation for customs review." Marcus activated the communications array, transmitting the carefully prepared documentation that would identify him as a returning mining consortium representative with a legally purchased slave. The paperwork was flawless, backed by months of preparation and the full resources of the Terran Liberation Front, but he still felt his pulse quicken as they waited for a response. "Meridian's Edge, you are cleared for docking bay 77. Please note that your passenger manifest indicates transported sentient property. Be advised that slavery is prohibited in human space, and your passenger will be processed according to Terran Liberation Protocol upon arrival." The formal language couldn't hide the warmth in the controller's voice, and Marcus found himself smiling as he acknowledged the clearance. Terran Liberation Protocol was the legal framework humanity had established for exactly this situation, providing immediate freedom and support for any sentient being brought into human space under conditions of slavery. "What happens next?" Kirith had asked as they approached the station's docking facilities. "Medical evaluation, legal documentation, and then a very long conversation with some very important people," Marcus replied. "The intelligence you're carrying could change everything, but it'll need to be verified and analyzed by people with a lot more authority than I have." The docking process was routine, but Marcus could see the subtle signs that their arrival was being given special attention. Security personnel in civilian clothing positioned themselves throughout the docking bay, and he spotted at least 2 individuals whose careful positioning and alert demeanor marked them as intelligence operatives rather than standard port authority. As they prepared to disembark, Marcus found himself thinking about the moment 3 days earlier when he had looked at a broken slave in a corner cage and decided to act on impulse rather than strategy. That decision had led them here, to a moment that might reshape the entire political landscape of galactic civilization. "Before we go out there," Marcus said, "I want you to know that whatever happens next, you're not alone in this. The TLF doesn't abandon its allies, and humanity doesn't forget its debts." Kirith turned to face him, her expression serious but no longer carrying the weight of despair he had seen in the market. "And I want you to know that I understand the risk you took by purchasing me. You could have completed your mission without that complication. The fact that you chose not to tells me something important about your species." The docking bay was controlled chaos as they emerged from their ship. Medical teams moved forward immediately to attend to Kirith, their approach professional but gentle as they conducted the standard health assessment required for all refugees. The neural collar was removed with careful precision, its deactivation causing a visible relaxation in her posture as the last symbol of her captivity fell away. Marcus was immediately approached by a woman in the dark blue uniform of TLF Intelligence, her colonel's insignia marking her as someone with significant authority in their organization. She was tall for a human, with the kind of composed demeanor that suggested extensive experience in delicate situations. "Captain Chen," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "Colonel Sara Martinez, TLF Intelligence Division. We've been monitoring your mission with great interest. I understand you have information that requires immediate attention." Marcus shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that suggested someone accustomed to making difficult decisions quickly. "Yes, ma'am. Information that could change our entire approach to combating the slave trade, but it comes with complications." Colonel Martinez glanced toward where Kiroweth was being attended by the medical team, her expression thoughtful. "So I understand. A HFY refugee with 3 years of first-hand intelligence about trade network operations. That's either incredibly valuable or incredibly dangerous, depending on how we handle it." "Both, I suspect," Marcus replied. "She's agreed to share everything she knows, but she's not just a source of information. She's a person who's suffered more than anyone should have to suffer, and she deserves to be treated as such." "Understood, Captain." "The debriefing will be conducted with full respect for her status as a free individual under Terran law, but I need you to understand that intelligence this sensitive will draw attention from the highest levels of government. There will be questions about methods, authorization, and political implications that go far beyond our mission parameters." Marcus had expected this complication. The TLF operated with significant autonomy, but purchasing a slave, even as part of an intelligence operation, was the kind of action that would require explanation and justification to civilian oversight committees and diplomatic authorities. The fact that it had yielded valuable intelligence would help, but there would still be consequences to navigate. The medical team completed their initial assessment and approached with their report. "Colonel, the subject shows signs of long-term malnutrition and chronic stress, but her overall health is stable. The neural collar caused some minor neurological irritation, but nothing that won't heal with time. We're recommending 3 days of observation and nutritional rehabilitation before any intensive debriefing begins." Colonel Martinez nodded, then turned to include Kiroweth in their conversation. "Miss Kiroweth, I'm Colonel Martinez. I want to personally welcome you to human space and assure you that you are now free under Terran law. We understand that you have information that could be valuable to our operations, but your cooperation is entirely voluntary. You have the right to legal representation, medical care, and time to adjust to your new circumstances before making any decisions about sharing that information." Kiroweth listened to this formal declaration with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that might have been amazement. "You are offering me choices," she said finally. "That is something I had almost forgotten existed. It's something that should never be taken from anyone," Colonel Martinez replied firmly. "Now, we have quarters prepared for you in the civilian section of the station, with medical monitoring and counseling support available. Captain Chen will be debriefed separately, but if you choose to share your intelligence with us, he can be present during those sessions if you prefer." Marcus felt a surge of respect for his superior officer's handling of the situation. The colonel was managing to balance intelligence requirements with humanitarian concerns in a way that honored both the mission and the person at the center of it. Over the following days, the debriefing process unfolded, with careful attention to both the intelligence value of Kiroweth's information and her psychological well-being. The sessions were conducted in comfortable surroundings with medical personnel present, and Kiroweth was given full control over the pace and scope of information sharing. The intelligence itself proved even more valuable than Marcus had anticipated. Kiroweth's eidetic memory provided details about slave trade operations that filled gaps in human understanding and revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Her information about corporate involvement was particularly damaging, naming specific human companies that had purchased slaves through intermediaries while publicly supporting anti-slavery initiatives. But perhaps more importantly, her strategic insights helped TLF analysts understand the political and economic structures that sustained the slave trade. She identified key decision-makers, critical infrastructure, and financial relationships that formed the backbone of the entire system. With this information, the TLF could move beyond reactive operations to proactive dismantling of trade networks. The political implications became clear within hours of the initial intelligence assessment. Colonel Martinez briefed Marcus on the classified discussions taking place at the highest levels of human government where officials were grappling with the scope of action required to address what they now understood about galactic slavery. The Colonial Defense Ministry is considering a complete trade embargo against any system that permits slave markets, she explained during one of their private meetings. The economic disruption would be massive, but the intelligence Kiriath provided makes it clear that half measures won't be sufficient. Marcus understood the gravity of what she was describing. An embargo of that scope would essentially force humanity out of galactic civilization, as it currently existed, challenging other species to choose between economic relationships with humans and tolerance of slavery. It was the kind of moral ultimatum that could either transform galactic society or isolate humanity permanently. What about military action? Marcus asked. The intelligence includes precise locations and schedules for slave auctions throughout the sector. That's being discussed as well, but the political complexities are enormous. Military action against slave markets would essentially be declaring war on the economic interests of half the galaxy. It would need to be coordinated with allies, and we're still not sure which other species might be willing to support that kind of action. The conversations continued for days, with intelligence analysts, political advisors, and military planners all contributing to assessments of possible responses to the slave trade revelations. Through it all, Kiriath participated as both information source and strategic advisor, her unique perspective proving valuable in ways that went far beyond her specific knowledge of trade operations. As the debriefing process neared completion, Marcus found himself thinking about the broader implications of what they had accomplished. What had started as a routine intelligence-gathering mission had become something much larger, a catalyst for moral and political decisions that would define humanity's place in galactic civilization for generations to come. The slave market of Zephyria Prime seemed like a distant nightmare now, but Marcus knew that thousands of beings remained in cages throughout the galaxy, waiting for someone to choose them, to see their worth as persons rather than property. The intelligence they had gathered and the political processes it had triggered were just the beginning of what would need to be a fundamental transformation in how galactic civilization operated. Standing in the observation deck of New Geneva Station, looking out at the stars where that transformation would unfold, Marcus reflected on the strange turns that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter in a slave market had become the foundation for what might be the most significant moral crusade in human history. And at the center of it all was a blue-skinned woman who had survived 3 years of hell while holding on to hope that someone, someday, would see her as more than broken property. The future was uncertain, filled with political complexities and moral challenges that would test everything humanity claimed to believe about the value of sentient life. But for the first time since beginning his undercover mission, Marcus felt genuine optimism about the outcome. They had the intelligence they needed, the political will to act, and most importantly, they had the moral clarity that came from looking another person in the eye and choosing to treat them as they deserved to be treated. Whatever came next, they would face it together. 6 months after their return from Zephyria Prime, Marcus stood in the packed gallery of the Galactic Consortium's High Court on Centauri Alpha, watching as the most significant legal proceeding in galactic history reached its climax. The courtroom buzzed with tension as representatives from dozens of species filled every available seat. Their attention focused on the 3-judge panel that would determine not just the fate of the accused, but the moral direction of galactic civilization itself. The transformation in those 6 months had been staggering. What had begun as one captain's impulsive decision to purchase a slave had cascaded into a complete restructuring of humanity's relationship with the galaxy. The intelligence Kiriath provided had been combined with evidence gathered by dozens of other TLF operations, creating an prosecutorial case so comprehensive that even species with economic interests in the slave trade couldn't dismiss it. Seated in the witness section, Kiriath looked nothing like the broken figure Marcus had first encountered in that corner cage. Proper nutrition and medical care had restored her physical health, while the psychological support provided by human specialists had helped her process 3 years of trauma without losing the fierce intelligence that had sustained her through the worst of it. She wore the formal attire of a diplomatic advisor, having been granted special status as a representative of extinct civilizations whose people remained enslaved throughout the galaxy. The proceedings had taken months to organize, requiring delicate negotiations between human diplomats and consortium authorities, who had initially been reluctant to legitimize what they saw as human interference in established galactic commerce. But the evidence was too comprehensive to ignore, and public pressure from multiple species had eventually forced the consortium to convene a formal tribunal. Chief Prosecutor Elena Vasquez, formerly of the Terran Colonial Legal Division, stood to present the final summary of charges. Her voice carried across the silent courtroom, as she began to read from the massive case file that represented months of investigation and preparation. Honored judges, the evidence presented over the past month demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendants have engaged in systematic violation of the Consortium Charter's provisions regarding sentient rights. We have documented 347 slave markets operating in clear violation of interspecies law, 23 government officials accepting bribes to ignore slave trafficking, and 89 corporations using slave labor while publicly claiming compliance with ethical business practices.
The defendants section included some of the most powerful figures in galactic commerce and politics.
Valorian trade ministers, Krellian military contractors, and human corporate executives sat side by side, united in their shared culpability for a system that had commodified sentient life for centuries. Their legal teams had fought every charge with the resources that vast wealth could provide. But the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus watched as Prosecutor Vasquez continued her presentation, knowing that every piece of evidence she cited had been gathered through operations like his own. The TLF's intelligence network had expanded dramatically following his mission to Zephyria Prime, with covert operatives documenting slave trade operations throughout the galaxy. But it was Kirith's information that had provided the roadmap for the entire investigation. The witness testimony of Kirith of the Windless Moons, Vasquez continued, has provided this court with unprecedented insight into the operational structure of the galactic slave trade. Her 3 years of observation, while legally classified as property, gave her access to information that no conventional intelligence operation could have obtained. Through her testimony, we have been able to trace financial networks, identify key decision-makers, and document the systematic nature of these violations. The defense attorneys had tried various strategies to discredit Curate's testimony, questioning her memory, her motivations, and her legal status during the period when she gathered the intelligence. But her eidetic recall had made their challenges unsuccessful, and her dignified presence during weeks of testimony had clearly impressed the judges. The political implications of the trial extended far beyond the courtroom. Humanity's response to the slave trade revelations had sent shockwaves through galactic civilization, forcing every species to take public positions on issues that many had preferred to ignore. The economic embargo threatened by human leadership had been carefully implemented, cutting off trade relationships with any system that permitted slave markets, while offering enhanced partnerships to those willing to criminalize the practice. The results had been dramatic. Within 3 months of the embargo's implementation, 17 systems had passed emergency legislation outlawing slavery within their territories. Economic pressure had accomplished what moral arguments had failed to achieve for centuries, demonstrating that the slave trade's apparent strength masked fundamental vulnerabilities. But the political transformation had come with costs. Humanity's aggressive stance had strained relationships with traditional allies and created new enemies among species that profited from the existing system. Several Krellian military leaders had issued statements describing human interference as cultural imperialism, while Valorian trade guilds had accused humanity of economic warfare designed to eliminate competition. The most surprising development had been the formation of the Liberation Alliance, a coalition of species that had committed to joint military action against slave markets. Led by humanity, but including the Andromedan Federation, the Tausetian Republic, and surprisingly, a faction of reformed Valorians, the Alliance had conducted precision strikes against major slave trading facilities throughout the sector. Marcus had participated in several of these operations, leading strike teams that combined intelligence gathering with direct rescue missions. The irony wasn't lost on him that his career had evolved from undercover spy to Liberation Force commander, but the transition felt natural given what he had witnessed on Zephyria Prime. The Alliance operations had been remarkably successful, liberating thousands of enslaved beings while capturing intelligence that further exposed the scope of the trade networks. But they had also escalated tensions throughout the galaxy, creating a state of undeclared war between the Alliance and species that refused to abandon the slavery system. In the courtroom, Prosecutor Vasquez was concluding her final argument with a statement that captured the moral stakes of the entire proceeding. This case represents more than a legal judgment on the defendants before this court. It represents a choice about what kind of civilization we want to be. The evidence shows that slavery persists not because it is economically necessary or culturally inevitable, but because we have chosen to permit it through our silence and complicity. She paused, her gaze moving across the packed courtroom to settle on the judicial panel. The defendants will claim that they were operating within existing legal frameworks, that their actions were justified by precedent and commercial necessity. But the victims whose suffering we have documented deserve better than legal technicalities. They deserve justice, and they deserve a galaxy that recognizes their fundamental right to freedom. The defense presentations that followed were technically competent but emotionally hollow, focusing on legal precedents and jurisdictional questions while carefully avoiding the moral dimensions of the charges. Marcus found himself thinking about all the beings he had seen in cages during his undercover mission, wondering how any legal argument could justify what had been done to them. When the court recessed for deliberation, Marcus and Kiriath met in one of the diplomatic lounges reserved for case participants. The months of testimony and legal proceedings had forged their partnership into something deeper than their original alliance, creating a friendship built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Whatever the court decides, Kiriath said as they watched the diplomatic activity through the lounge's windows, what we've accomplished here goes beyond legal judgments. The galaxy is having conversations about slavery that it avoided for centuries. That change is permanent, regardless of how the judges rule. Marcus nodded, understanding what she meant. The trial had been broadcast throughout consortium space, creating public awareness of the slave trade that made future ignorance impossible. Even species that opposed the legal proceedings couldn't pretend anymore that slavery was a minor issue affecting only primitive worlds. The real question, Marcus replied, is whether this becomes the beginning of systematic change or just another legal precedent that gets ignored when it becomes inconvenient. Their conversation was interrupted by the announcement that the court was returning to session. The deliberation had lasted 6 hours, longer than expected for what many had assumed would be a straightforward verdict given the overwhelming evidence. Chief Judge Catherine, an elderly Andromedan whose tentacled face showed no readable expression, called the court to order and began reading the tribunal's decision. After careful consideration of the evidence and arguments presented, this court finds that the defendants have violated multiple provisions of the consortium charter regarding the treatment of sentient beings. The courtroom erupted in reactions ranging from celebration to outrage, but the judge continued speaking over the noise. However, this court also recognizes that the defendants operated within legal frameworks that existed at the time of their actions, frameworks that this tribunal lacks authority to retroactively criminalize. Marcus felt his heart sink as the implications became clear. A technical acquittal based on legal precedent would undermine everything they had worked to accomplish, sending a message that slavery was morally wrong but legally acceptable. But Judge Catherine wasn't finished. Therefore, while this court cannot impose criminal penalties for past actions, we hereby issue a permanent injunction prohibiting any further participation in slave trading by the defendants or their affiliated organizations. Additionally, this court formally petitions the Consortium Assembly to amend the Charter to explicitly criminalize all forms of sentient slavery, with enforcement authority granted to member species acting individually or collectively. The courtroom exploded into chaos as the implications sank in. The decision was simultaneously a legal victory and a political challenge, establishing the moral authority to act against slavery while stopping short of retroactive punishment. It was, Marcus realized, probably the best outcome they could have hoped for, given the political complexities involved. More importantly, the formal petition to the Assembly would force every member species to take a public vote on slavery criminalization. The political pressure created by that vote would accomplish what legal precedent alone could not, making continued tolerance of slavery an explicit policy choice that each species would have to defend to its own population. In the weeks that followed the tribunal's decision, the political momentum became unstoppable. Species after species announced support for the Charter amendments, many citing economic pressure and public opinion as factors in their decisions. The Liberation Alliance expanded to include a majority of consortium members, creating enforcement capabilities that made slavery practically impossible in most systems. The former slave markets of Zephyria Prime were converted into refugee processing centers, helping liberated beings establish new lives and systems that would treat them as persons rather than property. Kiriath had accepted a position with the Galactic Refugee Commission, using her experience and intelligence to develop support programs for trauma survivors from dozens of species. Marcus had been promoted to Director of Liberation Operations, overseeing TLF activities that had expanded from intelligence gathering to active rescue missions. The work was dangerous and emotionally demanding, but it provided the kind of purpose he had never found in conventional military service. Standing once again on the observation deck of New Geneva Station, now expanded to accommodate the massive increase in refugee processing and alliance coordination activities, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The galaxy was far from perfect, and slavery hadn't been completely eliminated, but the systematic nature of the trade had been broken. Kiriath joined him at the viewport, her presence as comfortable as that of an old friend. Together they watched as another transport full of liberated beings approached the station, their arrival representing lives saved and futures restored. Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you had walked past my cage that day? Kirith asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. Without her intelligence, the TLF investigation would have taken years longer to develop the evidence needed for prosecution. Without the moral clarity that came from looking into her eyes and choosing to act, he might never have found the courage to take the risks that led to this moment. I think someone else would have stepped forward eventually, he said finally. Maybe not that day, maybe not in that place, but somewhere. Someone would have decided that the system was wrong and chosen to do something about it. Kirith smiled, the expression transforming her features in ways that still reminded Marcus of their first meeting in that corner cage. Perhaps. But it was you who chose, and it was that choice that changed everything. As they watched the transport dock and its passengers begin their journey toward freedom, Marcus understood that she was both right and wrong. His choice had been important, but it was only one link in a chain of decisions that stretched back through history and forward into a future where slavery would hopefully become impossible rather than merely illegal. The galaxy was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that sentient beings were more than the sum of their economic value. It was a lesson that had to be taught, one person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of recognition that said, I see who you really are, and you matter. The work was far from over, but standing there with someone who had survived the worst the galaxy could offer and emerged stronger for it, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since his first day undercover in the slave markets. Genuine hope for the future.
The broken ones, it turned out, were often the strongest of all.
They just needed someone to see past the scars and recognize the unbreakable spirit underneath. And once that recognition began, it spread like wildfire, transforming not just individuals, but entire civilizations. In the end, that was humanity's true gift to the galaxy. Not advanced technology or military power, but the stubborn refusal to abandon anyone who could still be saved. It was a gift that kept giving, one choice at a time, one rescued life at a time, until freedom became not just a hope, but an inevitable reality.